According to our agenda now, the next 30 minutes or so is dedicated to hearing what today has inspired in your minds, or what you brought along today before you came, how those views changed. So it's really designed to try and hear from the floor as much as possible, but it will need some focus on the stage, on the panel. So I'm going to ask, Paul's made a crappy exit, so I'm going to ask the other speakers to just take a seat up there for now. This is from Maria, I think. Okay, asking models have been mentioned by most of the speakers throughout the day. What type of models are we talking about? And we'll start at that end now.
So, at least in my talk, we're talking about models, say, of the interaction of humans and connected devices. But there are different models depending on what to do. So one extreme is using what people call agent-based models, which in a way you could be cynical and say we don't understand what's happening, we just simulate it. And there's another group of people who try to coming more from physics. So there are people who call themselves sociologists, but by training are theoretical physics people as another extreme, who try to build analytical models derived from statistical physics, and both of them described interestingly. What I find interesting is, and it's in relation to what you have been saying, is that it turns out, and I found it fascinating to see, that very often you, of course, cannot predict what a single human does. But if you look at a certain group of enough people, that they are as predictable as are particles in a gas.
Okay. Other views on models?
Well, I'm next, so I'll say something, but I think that it's a funny question to ask, what models are we talking about? Because it depends on the question that's being raised, right? Too often, I think, at least when you work monodisciplinary, in a monodisciplinary environment, your model is already kind of pre-given, without much reflection. And that's the pleasure of working in a multidisciplinary environment. It's because you're challenged to put your conceptualizations into another's models and vice versa. And from that, you grow your own models. I don't like the idea of being married to a model or a theoretical position. I'm a scientist, not a technician, right? And I think that this is a fun topic to keep in mind.
I wouldn't mind being married to a model, but they should eat more. I don't like these anorexic models too much.
They're always a way too.
Yeah, but the point is that if they would eat enough, the point with models, we see a transition in our science where we start to go with, let's say, the mathematically defined laws of reality that would sort of be microscopic with respect to macroscopic phenomena. Models now try to be more descriptive at multiple levels of organization. So I think it's really a transition in how we're trying to explain reality, and a model becomes more like an abstraction of or a redescription of data as opposed to, let's say, a law-like explanation. So I think there's really a shift there, and models are, if you want, also have a looser coupling to reality than a more law-like explanation. So although models like the Watson and Crick example I showed you as a physical model can be very powerful, of course, if models become more descriptive and you say, look, I use a machine learning classifier and this is now my model, that's of course a very loose notion of models. So I think we do have some challenges there, that models should satisfy still criteria of explaining, predicting and control.
Well, as a psychologist, the sort of models that I'm talking about are generally what we call non-authentic models, so the models of populations, as you said before, rather than models of individuals themselves. The thing that I find in this area that I was talking about is that we can take some general laws from these models, such as the relationship between motivation and demand. But it is very difficult to predict where, say, a single person is going to give up on a certain scale. So there is that sort of variability there. And so this is why, certain things like machine learning algorithms when applied to individuals can become very useful in order to say, we know what the model is, but in order to make actual predictions about a particular individual. So it's a two-level sort of thing.
So in design of these models, we often see the problem from two aspects. On one aspect, theoretically, models are effective ways of representing theory, which is often quite lacking in some fields. But on the other hand, models, from a more practical viewpoint, we could build models to test and to become an iterative process and test theory. And you can improve the models. So, for example, it's a way towards it.
To add something about models, one type I did mention are sort of machine learning statistical models, which are very interesting because you use them to represent or learn complex human behaviors, speech recognition. But in the end, it's nothing more than a statistically collected amount of data in which you define some sort of a separation surfaces to separate, say, different words. Now, why it's interesting is the connection with data, because a lot of people say controversially that big data is able to represent complex to replace complex scientific models. And that works by the statistical thing. Think about, say, what happens when I drop my phone on the floor? I can go to the Newton's law of gravity, compute the speed, and then know the metal hardness and understand what happens. I can just say I don't care about it. I go to the internet, search all the videos I see, try to match it using a statistical model. It's not the same, but and then I know what happens. So essentially there's so much data that you can say I can now represent the entire world in all its complexity simply as a machine learning statistical model. I don't believe it, but it's something that you can postulate that I just have a representation of everything based on statistical machine learning model.
Yeah, but I gave you a counter example. We talked about that, right? Because actually I can take his phone and drop it on the floor, and then it will be very difficult to find a YouTube video that will tell you what he will do.
But actually, that's about this machine learning. If you don't have machine learning, it's not about having exactly the same thing, but data that is similar enough for me to draw
conclusions. But that's not important. It's about, I think also you guys said earlier, like, but humans are individually complex, but if you group them together, it becomes simple. And I think we have to be very careful with this, because humans do build cities like this, and they create culture, and then they create really strange macroscopic regularities in civilizations. That's not easy stuff. Of course, when there's a bomb going off somewhere and everyone runs away from that, you can say, you see, we can really describe it, but that's rather low complex behavior, I would say. So we should be very careful with that.
Sure.
Okay. So I want to encourage contributions from the book. Can I ask everyone to say your name and where you're from? Also, students on the platform, use highest voices in volume, not pitch, so people can hear that.
So this is related. My name is Joshua Melville. I'm a DPhil student and researcher at the University of Oxford. So I think in Matt's talk we got the beginnings of a sort of critical stance towards data, and leading from what you were saying there, I thought this is a great opportunity to ask, can we be critical of big data openly? I'm sure our funders aren't present, so let's talk seriously about this. Are the problems of big data a result of the specification of big data? Are we creating issues for ourselves in a way that we're talking up this idea of a seductive form of data that we call big? And are these problems new and novel, or are they just extensions of problems we've known about for a long time?
Is it the emperor's new data?
Start again, or go ahead. Let somebody else start now.
Matt, you were name checked in the question.
I might end up marrying something else now. So.
Better be careful, you should stop till you were ahead. No, I agree. I think that, I don't know if I fully agree, but there's definitely a fetish, if you like, for data. And the more of it, the better, and so on. And what I was trying to get at in my talk is that it doesn't mean anything by itself. Actually, it's just an accidental byproduct of the design of an artifact. So when we look at, if you have enough data about this, we'll be able to predict that. Yeah, let's not forget that the data is already biased. There's no neutral data, right? Data is, even in the way we talk about it, we say, this is raw data. Well, raw, in a sense, it's already been processed by a sensor, right? It's no longer raw. It's now a product of an artifact. And as such, I don't mind that there's a lot of it, and I think it's great, but let's stop the fetishization, if you like, of this purity of data, because it's already corrupt by virtue of existing.
I think I just wanted to clarify one thing is, you talk about data, information, knowledge. They are different. If we put it simply, data is raw. Data in the context becomes information, and information in the context becomes knowledge. So we are different levels. So sometimes people mix all these three into data. That's completely comes.
But we should keep in mind that this is the classic debate between Bacon and Hobbes, right? Hobbes was really challenging Bacon. Is look, of course you can say, look, we need to make observations, and that's why we constrain the mind in understanding reality. But Hobbes said, but look, when we observe, it's always transduced through some instrument, and this implicitly imposes biases which you could interpret as a theory. And so I think it's very much that same debate we're looking at now. It's just we have more layers, if you want, of transduction in between, because observation has become more and more indirect. Right? But I think fundamentally it's exactly that problem. It's very classic problem.
So I want to say that humans have this tendency, if something new comes along, just hoping that that's going to be the holy grail, the solution to everything. And it turns out it's not this way. And I think that big data is a great thing. It can really make things possible.
This one's really worth it.
So I think big data is really something that enables us to, I haven't seen the YouTube video of that. It enables us to do things we're not able to do without big data. But there are problems that big data cannot solve. And it's not a solution to everything. And also, it's difficult to process. Everybody who did machine learning knows that adding features and dimensions to your feature space will very often reduce the performance of your classifier. Not because there's no information in this data, but because your means are so limited that you can extract more information from less data, although there is less information in there because you're just stupid to do so with enough data.
Can I give one example of that, actually? An example is the radiation effect of the Geiger-Moller tube, right? So in the original inception of this device, it was really not electronic at all. It was not. It was a very complex one, very simplistic version of it, and it worked perfectly. We've since made a much more complex model of the Geiger-Moller tube, and it produces a lot more data. But as such, it requires on top of it another level of processing to make sense of the data. The amount of data produced by a Geiger-Moller tube today is on the level of complexity of instant replay in a football match, but the accuracy is not necessarily very different, right? That's to me a very compelling argument that data actually in itself is not better or worse, it just depends on how you use it, right?
Could I say something? What I want to say, can you hear me okay at the back? If I show a bit louder? Okay. A bugbear in the area that I work in, effective computing, is that, it's my bugbear, it's not a bugbear in the area, is machine learning algorithms that are applied to data a lot. So what you see there, people collect a lot of data, they then apply these algorithms to the data. And what you have is algorithm-led hypotheses, basically, which to me seems to open up all kinds of multiple interpretations. I'm kind of old-fashioned in a way, I'm a bit more like Paul was describing in his talk. I like to see a theory leading to testing to specific hypotheses. I don't like to see an analysis producing hypotheses, which then produces this sort of circularity. And for me, in the effective computing area, there is too much testing and too little theory, and I do think it creates the data equivalent of a mirage in a way in people's eyes.
Hi, it's Sam Gordon. I work for a company for the first year in. I keep seeing statements saying that the brain is really complicated, like it's the most complicated thing in the universe. And I'm a scientist and I find that really hard to believe. I'm just wondering, what's the basis behind those claims?
Okay, well, all right, so the question is, why is the brain the most complicated physical system in the universe? That's because we haven't found anything more complex. But, no, wait, don't worry, I'll answer. So the point is just, look, the brain, why people talk about its complexity is we have about, let's say, 80 billion neurons in the human brain. Each of these neurons in itself is already a pretty complex machine. And then each of these neurons will make, let's say, between 5,000 to 10,000 connections with other neurons somewhere in that system in ways that are really not very deterministic. Like your brain is pretty different from mine, and you're probably very happy about that. So if you just add up these numbers, it's on the ground, on those grounds, people say it's the most complex system that we know. All right, this is roughly, and then don't forget, right? All these connections and neurons are in this soup of chemicals that all have very strange and non-linear effects again on their operation. Right, so you have a multi-level organized system, right? So for instance, And you can say, raise your hand, I do this, right? So now you have a causal effect at a very high level, but in the meantime, I might lose my dopamine, let's say, and suddenly I become paralyzed. So you see you have a multi-level of organization, causality going bidirectionally through that system, with a core hardware that has many, many connections and many degrees of freedom. It's on those grounds it's called the most complex system that we know.
And I'm not being a brain scientist, I would maybe even disagree. I think it's a very complex system. And the really problem with the brain is that you cannot just say, cut it and study it in operation as much as you would like, right? I think for me, I think it's a big problem. I cannot just go and start cutting and putting probes.
You can do it, but you might not learn what you want to learn.
There's this limit to how invasively you can study it. And also for me, one of the things is that we are having the brain study the brain, which I think makes the whole thing slightly complex.
It's conceptually challenging, absolutely.
Yeah. And for me, it's a fundamental question: is a human just an extremely well-built Turing machine, or can humans do something that Turing machines cannot do? And a lot of people coming from humanities will always say, "Of course, humans are fundamentally different." But the answer is we have no bloody clue. Maybe we are just glorified Turing machines, where maybe we are and that would be very, very comfortable for us. Because then we could one day be like a computer that's like a human, but maybe we are not.
But that's easy to refute.
I don't think so.
Or you really believe you're being programmed by your wife?
I think I agree with that.
No, wait, this is the code. Right? The code has to come from somewhere. And the traditional argument was always, well, it's genetic. Right? That was the 60s and the 70s. Until people discovered we only have about 33,000 genes defining what we are. So that's not enough coding space to really define that machine. Okay?
The point is, you cannot prove that humans actually do something. It's not Turing computable. At least not through a probabilistic Turing machine. It's not so easy.
Okay, my guys, I'm going to stop this one.
But he's wrong.
This sounds like one thing to argue about over a glass of wine, and I heard a question on the floor. And I also want to get back on the application, because we've got a few questions from the flashcards on applications. So, question here first.
Hi, Shaheen, Director User Experience at the Economist Group. Is there a reason why you think our brains are actually designed in a certain way, through evolution or not? So you got the conscious brain doing activity.
Try that.
Testing. Is it working?
I don't know. Probably not.
I could do a beatbox. Do you think our brains are currently kind of wired in a certain way for a reason? You were talking about creativity and moments of, I'm not going to say the aha moments, but you're thinking about a problem, you walk away from it, you're doing something else, your brain processes it, and actually come up with a solution. So this whole idea about actually getting big data and bringing it into the conscious, bringing it to the fore, is that going to be helpful? Is it just going to overload people? People they've got bandwidth rationality. Every day is big data processing for people going to the tube to work and stress and everything else. So do we think we're trying to augment, or are we kind of actually going to interfere in some ways and just switch something else off by presenting all this big data in a certain meaningful way?
Is it a red herring?
Well, the brain is the product of biological evolution, right? So in that sense, whatever question we pose about the brain, we have to look at it in that context of evolution. And we didn't evolve in the world of Facebook and Google, fortunately you might say. But that means our brain is a bag of tricks in some sense that helps us to adapt to the physical world in which we have to survive. Now, survival, certainly because of evolution, means reproduction, which implies action. So brains evolved very much for action in the real world in real time to support survival and reproduction. In a nutshell, you could summarize it like that. Now, this of course means that our brain is in the world with lots of biases. And now we have created this really complex environment filled with technology, right, where that might actually collide with these biases. There's an interesting book just came out written called The Shallows, for instance. Someone makes an argument that the internet now is basically preventing our brain from operating under normal conditions, because we're all pushed in, let's say, a domain of attention deficit disorder, where we have to sort of rapidly switch. We are not being conditioned anymore to pay attention for a long period of time to something, because it's not there. You're forced to follow all the hyperlinks, to just react to everything that is imposing its salience upon you. And there's an interesting point there. Because actually, I think we all have experienced how we got trapped in clicking all these links that brought you to useless information in the end, right? So this is really where you see that the information environment we have created for ourselves might be exploiting vulnerabilities of our brain, like novelty we react to very quickly, in a bottom-up fashion. It's called salience, right? So while in the meantime, for, let's say, a cognitive advancement, we need sustained effort. Right? So in that sense, understanding sort of the biological roots of what we are might help us to guide a little the process of how we shape this kind of data, or how we shape our interaction with technology. And in that sense, I do believe indeed that big data might be also riding in that same wave. Right? It is something that can grab us quickly, it's easy, it's not painful, no more deep thought required, because developing a theory hurts. Okay? It's the easy way out.
My take on this, or my response to this, actually not this is my take on this and my response to this is, I already gave you an example in my talk of people walking, leaving these trees behind them, okay? Now imagine an analogy, and I don't mean it as an offensive analogy, but with a snail or a slug, right? Snail moves along, it leaves a trail of slime behind it, okay? Kind of like a data trail. Well, that trail of slime, that data trail, enables locomotion, allows the snail to move through the world. Now, one thing that bothers me a little bit in the technology that I've spoken about is that, am I helping people by making this data available, or am I hindering them in some kind of way? Let me give you an example. I once had a research assistant, and she was doing a study for me one afternoon, and I came back the next day, and she said, sorry, I didn't run anybody yesterday. And I said, why? She said, well, I wasn't very well, so I went home. And I said, oh, what was the problem? And she said, well, I felt a little bit funny, and because I was in the lab, I thought I'd take my blood pressure, and it was kind of low, so I just thought I better go home. And this is not somebody who's medically naive. This was a nurse, an ex-nurse talking now. So part of me does realise that in my area where we're making physiological data available, where you're quantifying those kind of processes, am I helping people, or am I making a nation of hypochondriacs instead? Because it could very easily go the other way. Because really, we have an interoceptive system that tells us things that are going on inside our body, and by augmenting that with technology, we introduce a bias to the picture. That is a bias which has all kinds of cultural connotations from medicine, certainly in the Western world anyway. So I do feel that the provision of big data about the self, and about the physiology of the self, has to be framed in a certain kind of way in order to kind of discourage those sort of tendencies.
What's interesting about the example of the woman who went home earlier than she would have otherwise is that she took her cue from a sensor, right?
Exactly.
And she gave more credibility to the sensor than her own internal,
Yes.
I suppose she wasn't feeling as bad until she saw the sensor, oh, I'm sick, I better go, right? And we have a tendency, not just recently, I would actually argue since the beginning of humanity, since human development, we've already been using sensors, be it on the level of Stonehenge, be it on the level of water sensors with those sticks that move in the rain and so forth. These are all primitive sensors. We're very eager to give sensors more credibility than ourselves, as if there's some superior version, some unbiased version of the human mind. And that's a fallacy that we're maybe more and more quickly falling into with the seduction of high technology, which is very exciting stuff, but it comes at a cost. And we have to, when we look at big data and look at how we interact with technology, I think we need to be aware that of ourselves first and foremost, and of ourselves as a kind of sensor, right, distinct from the one in which we're interacting with.
I think it comes into the same category, that people tend to think in black and white. And the world is not black and white. Everything has a cost. And it's not saying that it's bad to trust sensors. There are a lot of situations where somebody comes to a doctor and says, I'm totally healthy, and an hour later he's dead. Right? And there are sensors that can actually tell the difference and prevent him dying. It's just that everything has to be used for a purpose, and you have to understand its advantages and disadvantages. That's true for data, for sensors, and for everything. So I think that's a message. Big data is not the savior of science or of anything. It's an additional tool that sometimes can lead you to good results and can sometimes mislead you.
But to add to this, something that might be interesting to also bring into the discussion is, if we take the brain analogy, right, then we see actually the brain throws away massive amounts of information as early as possible. You might all have seen these famous change blindness illusions, right? You're asked to follow people passing a basketball while a gorilla walks through and no one sees the gorilla because you have a task. Your brain ignores the rest, right? So if you want to apply it now to big data, there we see actually we are reverting this again. So like, oh no, let's embrace all this data because all these terabytes are just amazing and they love me. It's not going to work like that.
And that comes back, a lot of times we say we would like to build computers that can do things as humans do, as good as humans. Mm-hmm. And I believe even if that's possible, what you end up is computers that do things that humans do well and things that humans do poorly. Because humans do what they do well exactly because of this, right? Yeah. Because of the slide nets, you can recognize things the computer cannot. So you should be careful what you pray for.
Okay, so that's a good question coming there, but we did ask people from the form, so I'm going to ask a couple. This one's coming from Ben Fields from Inarcella. Ben. Okay, hi Ben. He's asked that someone said earlier that big data is too important to leave to engineers.
Yeah, right.
Okay, and that suggests a deficiency in engineering. Okay, and what should change to make engineering, practice and education work better together? Okay, so that's one question. A related one is from someone anonymous. So I don't know who it is. If you recognise it, you can put your hand up if you want to. The ideas here are mainly summarising the engineering and human sciences and the fact that they should work together, bringing an interdisciplinary approach. Is academia as open to these new ideas as it should be, or is more work needed to support the sort of interdisciplinary work we've heard about today? So this is kind of, what's the suit, the environment to enable the sorts of developments that we need?
Well, I think Matt was talking about this rather directly, no? So.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the division, the academic division, is an unfortunate byproduct of the history of science. Actually, I really have struggled with the difficulties inherent in working in a multidisciplinary group. Although we all have PhDs and all this advanced education and postdoctoral degrees, on one side we're all rather ignorant of one another. And the training in human sciences or social sciences is so distinct from the training in natural sciences. And you have the split division in cognitive science, which we were talking about earlier, which really screws everything up even further. So we have two tracks of psychology which have very different approaches to studying the human mind. This is really unfortunate because it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's that we need to somehow synthesize these. Reality is not disciplinary. It's not split up along the disciplines. And when a linguist attempts to describe a language using only linguistic theory, he'll fall short because language doesn't exist as such by itself. It involves acoustics, it involves learning, it involves a culture, on, and that's just language, never mind science, and some things more complex. So I think that the academic situation is not very open to this. It's very difficult to get, at least in the Netherlands, as far as I know, multidisciplinary type degrees. And it's very hard to find multidisciplinarily trained people, which we need for our team, who are open to kind of collaborative tasks like this. So I'm looking forward to a new era of education in which multidisciplinarism is not only encouraged but required as part of the educational system.
Is this one that we maybe throw back to people who are from industry working at the event here today? Do you notice problems, those people, your hands are early, in students coming out unable to work across disciplines, or does that not really evidence itself? Like, is it a real problem that we're discussing, or when it gets to the real world, does it not matter? Any comment?
I am actually working in between academia and industry, so I'm an engineering doctoral student. I'm funded by the industry, but I'm actually funded by the academia at the same time. And I see that lack of education in myself. So I'm a physicist, that's why I was asking the question about the models. So I could be applying physical models or physics-based models, or I could be applying neural networks in the data I have from engineering. But it's kind of, where do you go? What skills do I use? And what type of people should I be asking those questions to? So I want to model my data, but where do I go? It's kind of, I don't have that background, that knowledge, and I'm a doctoral student, so it's kind of, we lack that, I think.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll make a promotional note for the European Commission actually on this one, because they do fund interdisciplinary projects that require interdisciplinarity as part of the qualifying criteria, and we found it a very good model for working across engineering, computing, psychology, sociology, design, and probably lots of others that I've left off. So European Commission funding is definitely a good vehicle for interdisciplinary work.
So Tony, maybe I can add something to this, because I feel that there are at least two cultures here. And I found that this out also by working in these big European initiatives like the flagship, that there is a cultural divide between, let's say, natural science-oriented people and engineers. And for the natural science-oriented people, I would also include the psychologists without any problem. Because in all these disciplines, whether you go from biology to psychology, in the end, it is some sort of empirical validation that's your common reference. So it means you can completely disagree on something, but you can agree on doing an experiment and to abide by the outcome of that experiment. So you have a common reference that's external to your community and your debate. While in engineering, that is not as deeply ingrained. So there's not so much an agreement to what the common reference could be. So as a result, you have a bit more drift, let's say, in how people think about, let's say, the problems that they try to solve. So then you'll see that social factors in schooling become more important than seeking such an external reference. Now people try to remedy this now with benchmarking things, having common benchmark, let's say robot football or things like that. And it leads to some progress, but I do believe it's a more fundamental problem. We stumbled into that engineering some really large-scale exhibitions that we were running more than 10 years ago. With having people running through, you have to bring together psychologists and engineers. It didn't work. So we really started a new master program in Barcelona, trying to bring humanities, science, and technology together in one program, because we think it's really a void right now in the educational program in Europe and in the world.
I want to make add one thing to that. It's not the case that every science as compared to industry relies on some empirical experiment to prove or disprove hypothesis. Anthropologists don't conduct these experiments. Neither do many kinds of cognitive psychology.
Well, that was true to my argument. I said natural science.
Right. Yes, no, I'm aware, but this is
divided.
It's very elegant, and that's a nice solution. But there's a lot of scientists who belong to human sciences.
Wait, but it depends on how you want to define science, right? Because for science is not a social construct. Science really means adhering to the empirical method. Right?
So you wouldn't call anthropology a science?
Then if anthropologists are following these empirical methods, sure they are.
But they require experimentation.
This sounds like another one for you see Paul and Matt in the corner, they're having a heated debate. So there was a question of...
Yeah, hello, my name is Ben Mortimer. I work at an agency called Central Life. Matt, you mentioned before that there's a lot of data collected, but it's not really collected for the people who it's collected from. So it's this idea of kind of a data elite. Paul, you mentioned that as well as there being apps which you have to get permission, there were also kind of these Bluetooth systems which were kind of taking data without consent. And Jonathan, earlier on in the day, you mentioned this slightly nightmarish marketing scenario where you can walk into a shop and they're so shrewd that they can offer that you can't resist. Now, with this kind of unconscious data being collected, is it time for another, rather like Isaac Asimov's first law of robotics, is it time for another kind of first law of unconscious big data to protect humans?
So the question of privacy and consent is something that's always connected to big data, especially big social data. And it's a difficult one because you have to distinguish 4 kinds of data essentially. One is the data that is systematically collected by someone who is authorized and put into their database. That's data that's very easily discussed how to protect it. There's another kind of data that you go and put out there to the public, right? Something you put on a web page. I would argue by doing so, just like going naked in a public or something, you give your implicit consent of putting this data out there. There's a third type of data, is like we did with the app, somebody said, I'm giving you this data for the purpose of doing crowd density. That is what today is problematic, that things like big companies and companies we may have some association here, for example, is collect information from you, give you a service, but essentially information is value, it's money. And if you give somebody information, there should be a very clear contract. I give you this information for that purpose, for this service. This is missing. But there is a fourth kind, and that can be regulated. This is something that today is still a problematic issue because there is not enough good practice, but this can be regulated. But there's a fourth kind of information, which is something, you post something on the web page, he posts something on the web page, and then suddenly people can infer that I was here without putting my name. And there was this thing, we talked to sociologists who said, I want to have the right to control what information about me is in the public domain. And I told them the only way to guarantee is to forbid the internet and any form of public statement. Because
or kill anyone you encounter.
Or to have yourself killed, cremated, and such to the sun. Those are things, and that is basic science. It's laws of mathematics.
But what about if your heart rate increases or you look at something? Now this is something which you're really not controlling.
Could I say something to that? I mean, the things about privacy and consent, about big data, but about physiological data, about the self, is much more invasive because it's effectively listing information that maybe you don't know, information that is not conscious to you. I mean, that's the reason why it's useful. That's also the reason why it can potentially be very invasive for that. Now, most of the sensors that we talk about, they're actually physically placed on the person. So it's quite easy to say you have complete control over this data and how you share this data and what you do with it. But now we have systems that are, based on a camera, like taking the heart rate from the face, from a camera, where you don't have to have that. You're not aware that you're being monitored, in effect. So then that idea of consent and sharing the data becomes more problematic. I also think, I saw a paper last year about brain-computer interfaces, and someone said, we've hacked a brain-computer interface. Now really, you might as well hack a radio signal, to be honest, for the amount of information that it can tell you. Because a lot of the stuff that I'm working with, the physiological data, in order to be interpreted, it needs context. Without that context, it is noise, effectively. So yes, I agree with your concerns. I think that people should have the right to control their own physiological data. But I also think we should not leap into hysteria about it until we understand how it is together.
I'd add to that in behaviour in our everyday lives, face-to-face with people, we transmit a whole load of information that we're unaware of transmitting, and skilled people and artificially intelligent people are very good at inferring from that what you want, what you're thinking for, what your intention is. And so it happens already in face-to-face communication, so that doesn't mean it's not something we have to think about, but I don't think it's such a new, risky challenge.
But there's something else I would like to add to this, which is that it's really amazing what you guys collectively put out on the internet anyway, right? So the point was, before the social network revolution, there were all these concerns about privacy, like, oh, people might put their pictures online and they might see that you've been in London or something like this. And it turns out humans in general don't seem to care too much. They put the most amazing things out online that are completely incriminating of themselves, but they think it's even fun, right? So I think we all should take this into account. Do we really have the correct model of humanity in mind with all these concerns? So I think practically it will not be such a big problem as you might expect. And on the other hand, there are already regulations in place with respect to subliminal stimulation. For instance, this is in principle ruled out. On the other hand, I don't think you really believe that all these young girls in their bikinis who run around in these car shows are there because they like cars, right? So these are also forms of subliminal stimulation that are heavily already used in our society, that we also should acknowledge them. It's not that this is just a new thing that's happening now with this technology, right? This is a much deeper debate going on for a long time. And I also feel, as I agree with Johnny, I don't see this like a real deep problem.
Okay, so we'll get into a question from you, I think, in a second from your paper. We've got about 5 more minutes to have final questions in the summer and anything else from the floor before we continue our discussions over glass of wine at the back. So The questions I've saved, and I'm not going to read them in any particular order, I'll say the names and companies and the people. So Tara from Google has asked about what the opportunities are for the body blogger in terms of fitness and diet apps. Have you explored that already?
Yeah, we've not explored it. We've not explored it in earnest, to be honest. I think body bloggers are a general framework that can be applied to lots of different things. We would like to see a version of body blogger where, say, for example, jogging routes, and you could see like heat maps of jogging routes, and that kind of data we can use quite easily. But we're probably more interested in using body blogger for health monitoring purposes. One thing that's particularly interested in mine is stress as a health problem, because we all know that stress is a health problem, but it's kind of like a tip of the iceberg thing. We really don't know we start to quantify its effects. And people talk about hypertension, the silent killer, and all these kinds of things. So what I would like to see is body blogger pushed in that sort of direction. I know we're running the risk of creating a nation of hypochondriacs, but just so that we can, I think by seeing how stress is affecting your body physically is a great feedback in order to do things about your lifestyle and to experiment with your lifestyle to change things. So I think it's not an end in itself, but a move towards change.
So Tara, I recommend you go and find Stephen later and persuade him. Okay, next, Samuel Gordon, first year in Limited. Where's Samuel? Okay, his question was, how can big data, or the things that we're talking about today, be used to improve two things, productivity at work and to make people more adaptable?
Well, I don't wonder about that. Should we drop this whole utilitarian notion of productivity? And I think, look at the unemployment we have in Europe right now. They really believe most people are going to get a job anytime soon. So I think we should rethink more this kind of technology, the quality of life, quality of our existence. If it includes a job, that's great. If not, that's good as well. I mean, the world has changed. We're not in an industrial revolution anymore. And I think we should have a broader scope. And within that, we should really look at, okay, how do we use this to amplify human potentiality? And this can go in many different directions.
Great. And this, I think, maybe your question, town centre planning. How can big data improve town centre planning? That's not for you. That's for a designer. Or for Paul.
In my view, I don't think that big data will make a difference for town planning, because we are upset about a lot of existing town planning. People are not, town planners are not putting people in the center of the design process. As you just mentioned, a lot of architects, award-winning ones, you often see them with no people in it, because that's not the concern of the architects. And I think now, with this people-centered design theory, and we really wanted people to start thinking about what is the ultimate aim of the design. Do you really want it to improve people's life, or do you want to make a design statement? So that is some change happening in the design education. Depends on your philosophy. So I believe inclusive design is the future. So I will promote this when I educate students, but there are still programs which only emphasize problem on the style aspect. So you'll be seeing two different approaches to design.
Okay, so I'm going to thank our panelists. Thank you very much for your talk this afternoon and this morning, and for being on the panel. I'm going to wrap up now just to say thank you to you all for being here throughout the day. I hope you've enjoyed the presentations that you've had and the discussions that you've had, and we hope you enjoy a glass of wine and continuing the discussion. For me, today, I mentioned right at the start, was the key goal was to share what CEEDs is doing, and it was really very encouraging to see from this afternoon's presentations how CEEDs is very much in line with other innovators at the forefront of exploring how humans and big data together can generate meaningful experiences and interactions. So that's great, and we're happy. I want to say thank you again to Google Campus for giving us access to the room. Obviously, thank you to the European Commission Framework 7 project and Future Emerging Technologies for supporting us and helping us with today. We're going to keep the hashtag #SenseBigData live in the coming weeks and months, and we encourage you to come onto the CEEDs website and carry on interacting with us. You'll hear some promotions on the CEEDs website. Two things. One is the Convergent Science Network that Paul heads up, and that is probably the foremost interdisciplinary network in science and engineering and design and computing and robotics in this space at the moment. So I encourage you to log on and register there and subscribe to updates on the website, which is on your diary, calendar, program. And I think that's it. No, before you go, after you've drunk your wine, so you may want to keep it on so you know each other's names while you're drinking, but then don't forget to leave them at the back with Jane and Eva, the other Eva, I think they're both back there, just as you're leaving. Yeah, we'd be interested in any follow-up you have, so please email us or tweet us. Thank you very much and enjoy a glass of wine.
World in all its complexity simply is a machine learning statistical model. I don't believe it, but it's something that you can postulate that I just have a representation of everything based on statistical machine learning model.
Yeah, but I gave you a counter example. We talked about that, right? Because actually, I can take his phone and drop it on the floor, and then it will be very difficult to find a YouTube video that will tell you what he will do.
But actually, that's about this machine learning. You don't have machine learning is not about having exactly the same thing, but data that is similar enough for me to draw
conclusions. But it's not important. It's about, I think also you guys said earlier, like, oh, but humans are individually complex, yes, but if you group them together, it becomes simple. And I think we have to be very careful with this, because humans do build cities like this, and they create culture, and then they create really strange macroscopic regularities in civilizations. That's not easy stuff. Of course, when there's a bomb going off somewhere and everyone runs away from that, you can say, you see, we can really describe it, but that's rather low complex behavior, I would say. So we should be very careful with that. Sure.
Okay. So I want to encourage contributions from the book. Can I ask everyone to say your name and where you're from? Also, students on the platform, highest voices in volume, not pitch, so people can hear it.
So this is related. My name is Joshua Melville. I'm a DPhil student and researcher at the University of Oxford. So I think in Matt's talk we got the beginnings of a sort of critical stance towards data, and I just, leading from
according to our agenda now, the next 30 minutes or so is dedicated to hearing what today has inspired in your minds, or what you brought along today before you came, how those views changed. So it's really designed to try and hear from the floor as much as possible, but it will need some focus on the stage, on the panel. So I'm going to ask, Paul's made a crappy exit, so I'm going to ask the other speakers to just take a seat up there for now. This is from Maria, I think. Okay, asking, models have been mentioned by most of the speakers throughout the day. What type of models are we talking about? And I'm going to start at that end now.
So, at least in my talk, we're talking about models of the interaction of humans and connected devices. But there are different models depending on what to do. So one extreme is using what people call agent-based models, which in a way you could be cynical and say we don't understand what's happening, we just simulate it. And there's another group of people who try to coming more from physics. So there are people who call themselves sociologists, but by training are theoretical physics people as another extreme, who try to build analytical models derived from statistical physics, and both of them described interestingly. What I find interesting is, and it's in relation to what you've been saying, is that it turns out, and I found it fascinating to see, that very often you, of course, cannot predict what a single human does. But if you look at a certain group of enough people, that they are as predictable as are particles in a gas.
Okay. Other views on models?
Well, I'm next, so I'll say something, but I think that it's a funny question to ask, what models are we talking about? Because it depends on the question that's being raised, right? Too often, I think, at least when you work monodisciplinary, in a monodisciplinary environment, your model is already kind of pre-given, without much reflection. And that's the pleasure of working in a multidisciplinary environment, is because you're challenged to put your conceptualizations into another's models and vice versa. And from that, you grow your own models. I don't like the idea of being married to a model or a theoretical position. I'm a scientist, not a technician, right? And I think that this is a fun topic to keep in mind.
I wouldn't mind being married to a model, but they should eat more. I don't like these anorexic models too much.
They're always away too.
Okay, but the point is that we need enough. The point is, with models, we see a transition in our science where we started to go with, let's say, the mathematically defined laws of reality that would sort of be microscopic with respect to macroscopic phenomena. Models now try to be more descriptive at multiple levels of organization. So I think it's really a transition.
So in design, I think models, we often think the problem from two aspects. On one aspect, theoretically, models are effective ways of representing theory, which is often quite lacking in some fields. But on the other hand, models, from a more practical viewpoint, we could build models to test and to become an iterative process and test the theory. And you can improve the models. So, for example, it's a way towards that.
To add something about models, one type I did mention are sort of machine learning statistical models. They're very interesting because you use them to represent or learn complex human behaviors, speech recognition. But in the end, it's nothing more than a statistically collected amount of data in which you define some sort of a separation surfaces to separate, say, different words. Now, why it's interesting is the connection with data, because a lot of people say controversially that big data is able to represent complex to replace complex scientific models. And that works by the statistical thing. Think about, say, what happens when I drop my phone on the floor? I can go to the Newton's law of gravity, compute the speed, and know the metal hardness, and understand what happens. I can just say I don't care about it. I go to the internet, search all the videos I see, try to match it using a statistical model. It's not the same, but and then I know what happens. So essentially, there's so much data that you could say I can now represent the end.
In how we're trying to explain reality, and a model becomes more like an abstraction of or a redescription of data as opposed to, let's say, a law-like explanation. So I think there's really a shift there. And models are actually one of those have a looser coupling to reality than more law-like explanation. So although models, like the Watson and Crick example I showed you as a physical model, can be very powerful, of course, if models become more descriptive and you say, look, I use a machine learning classifier and this is now my model, that's of course a very loose notion of models. So I think we do have some challenges there, that models should satisfy still criteria of explaining, predicting, and control.
Well, the psychologist, the sort of models that I'm talking about are generally what we call non-authentic models, so the models of populations, as you said before, rather than models of individuals themselves. The thing that I find in this area that I was talking about is that we can take some general laws from these models, such as the relationship between motivation and demand. But it is very difficult to predict where, say, a single person is going to give up on a certain scale. So there is that sort of variability there. And so this is why certain things like machine learning algorithms when applied to individuals can become very useful in order to say, we know what the model is, but in order to make actual predictions about a particular individual. So it's a two-level sort of